Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Jeff Ander. I'm a director at Global Trade Review, also working with the Coriolis team this week, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this final webinar as part of this week's Future of Strategy virtual event. We've got a great lineup of experts eager to share their knowledge during this next hour, focused on trade sustainability. Quick spot of housekeeping. Please do use the Q&A function. We'll go through your questions towards the end of the session, or try to weave them in where appropriate. And we'll also strive for some concrete action points to hopefully be able to deliver on. Now, if I could ask our speakers to introduce themselves before we get into the discussion, perhaps starting with you, Marissa, and then we can hear from everyone.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I currently run the Trade Solution Development and Innovation team at Lloyds Bank. I'm also part of our Global Transaction Banking Working Group on Sustainability, and also part of the ICC Sustainable Trade Finance Working Group as well.
Great. Michael?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael von Spears. I was most recently at Standard Chartered running trade finance business for Europe and Americas. And I'm on the ICC Advisory Board and co-chair the Digitization Working Group.
Jacqueline, perhaps you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jacqueline Miner. I was from 2013 to 2017, the head of the European Union Commission's representation to the United Kingdom. I'm now happily retired.
And Shona.
Hi, I'm Shona Tatchell, and I'm the founder and CEO of Halo Trade, which is a fintech startup focused on sustainable supply chain financing. And I am a former banker, most recently with Barclays. And I also, like Marissa, I'm also part of the ICC Sustainability Working Group, and like Mike, also part of the Digitization Working Group for the ICC.
Great. So turning towards the focus of this discussion, I think we can all agree that the events of 2020 have shone a light on the sustainability challenges the world faces. Many feel there is no pandemic without a problem around sustainability, and many hope this provides the perfect opportunity to reassess attitudes. We know that there's a counterpoint to this, that we've all seen face masks strewn over parkland and a return to what's felt like sort of just general public littering, which has thrown into stark effect the amount of disposable plastics and the issues that this face. So I guess to quote the title of this session, how can trade be sustainable in the face of all of these challenges? So I guess firstly, starting with you, Marissa, you mentioned you represent both Lloyds, but also the Sustainable Trade Finance Working Group for the ICC. So we're in both of your hats. What does sustainability mean to you, and how do you feel this has changed, both in terms of the pandemic, but hopefully what was progress being made before then?
Yes, I also want to answer the question as a person as well. So I mean, sustainability to me, it really means living and doing business responsibly, and that will require changing our ways so that future generations can live and hopefully also thrive on our planet. I think part of that will mean reducing and in some cases reversing some of the damage that's been done. So pre-COVID, I think there was already a huge focus on sustainability. We saw rising coverage, we saw Greta Thunberg, we saw Extinction Rebellion, the public sentiments was already changing. We saw NGOs and activists focus on banks. So 2 years ago, we had the Barclays AGM interrupted by campaigners who were protesting their funding of fossil fuels. We saw our competitors acting at pace. We saw investors like BlackRock demanding action. But the thing that scared me the most, and this was pre-COVID, was that report done by the World Economic Forum that lists the top global risks. And the report from January this year, the top 5 global risks, all of them were environmental. 10 years ago, none of them were environmental. And that was by likelihood. And those 5 top environmental risks by likelihood are in the top 10 in terms of impact, right? And this is in January, so pre-COVID. Infectious diseases as a risk didn't even make the top 10 by likelihood, and it barely made it by impact. So that really is a big scare. So now thinking about COVID and what's happened during the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, lockdown, restrictions, carbon emissions dropped by 27% versus the same period last year. That's nice. but restrictions have lifted in some parts, and we think estimates show by the end of the year it's only going to be about 5% reduction. And unfortunately, we need about 5% reduction every year from now till 2050 to get to net zero by 2050. So the challenge is really big. And I think the problem is that small incremental change just isn't going to be enough. We're going to need systemic change. So big things need to be done. And just I've talked about kind of pre-COVID and then COVID, and I talked about scare. So the biggest scare I had during, I guess, or post-COVID was watching David Attenborough's film, A Life on Our Planet. And that was just so sobering. And I just hope everybody watches that. But maybe to end on a bit more of a positive note, I think that government has responded. There are a number of announcements over the last few months. There's a $3 billion fund for retrofit. There's a 10-point plan towards a green industrial revolution. It's the right direction, but we still got a long way to go, I think.
I think it's quite interesting as well. Someone reading a comment someone was making the other day that even the most positive news we're hearing around vaccines brings with it questions over fraud, environmental damage, more use of plastics, employment standards down those supply chains. So I think even from the positive developments we're seeing recently, there's a few questions to be answered. In terms of your role at Lloyds, Marissa, your role is head of trade innovation, I believe. So to what degree do you think innovation is focused on achieving more sustainable trade practices? And do you think, in terms of your own experience, is this reflective of the wider trade finance market and other institutions?
Yes, great question. I think overall, sustainability has become a source of differentiation and innovation. And in trade innovation in particular, Michael and Shona will know this well. We talk about, trade finance, so much paper, let's get rid of the paper. And in the past, it was more of an afterthought. Like, well, if we're going to remove the paper, that's less carbon, so that's sustainable. But I think that's really like just the tip of the surface, and that can't be the only story for trade, for sure, definitely. So it has to be so much more. And I think innovation in trade doesn't just have to be about new tech. And one of the important things that we've launched this year at Lloyds was just the inclusion of trade into our Clean Growth Finance Initiative. It's a program where we provide discounted funding to help businesses transition to a lower carbon, more sustainable future, right? So there's a practical, it's innovation, it's something new, but it didn't require kind of big fancy tech and so on. But that's just kind of a first and beginning start. And we included trade finance as part of that offering. But I think what's next is important. I think what's next beyond just green purpose kind of funding and financing, we need to look at supply chains. I think Shona might be nodding here, but we have to look at supply chains. So I think there's a statistic saying about 5%, a company's carbon footprint, if you look at their entire supply chain, you can multiply that impact by about five times, right? So that's big. And I think the question is, how could we use innovation and new tech and everything we've got, all the tools we've got, to measure, to evidence, to incentivize across supply chains a better behavior? And I think this is where new tech can really help, because a lot of the challenge we had in the past was just around how do we see, how do we measure, how do we evidence? I had some other thoughts on innovation in terms of trade and sustainability. Questions like, 3D printing, how is that going to work? A lot of trade is about things moving really long distances across the world. What about 3D printing? And also consumer preferences. How much is that going to change trade patterns? People are wanting to eat local nowadays. So just a couple of thoughts I had.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think that probably a good time to bring Michael in here. Michael, until recently, you were responsible for trade finance business in Europe and the Americas for a large international bank, Standard Chartered. But I guess now you've got a fresher perspective to bring here in many ways. You're on record as saying that sustainability is no longer just an adjunct to good business, but is indeed pivotal to achieving it. And various, multinational CEOs have made pledges, placing suppliers at the heart of business practice. What does that sort of thing mean in your view? And is that easier said than done?
Yeah, I think it's easier said than done. And I just wanted to add a point to what Marissa was saying. We sometimes confuse sustainability with green and environmental. I mean, for me, environmental impact is part of an overall sustainability dynamic. There's been a lot more focus on on impact on the planet in the last couple of years, which is, you know, Davos last year was really focused on carbon reduction and carbon emission reduction and meeting climate goals. And we saw a number of CEOs come up with some pretty aggressive pledges. I think a few CEOs sort of led the way. But this point, and I've been making this point for a number of years, irrespective of where I work. But you know, there was a survey done by the EIU in 2017 of 800 corporate execs headquartered in 8 different countries. They include both developed countries and developing countries. And on the face of that survey, it was really encouraging because an increasing number of firms saw the value of taking a more responsible approach to their supply chains. Nearly 8 in 10, so about 80% of respondents say their firms have responsible supply chains, right? But when you kind of peel the onion, it revealed a worrying degree of complacency by executives over how responsibly managed their supply chains actually were. So for example, a quarter of respondents said their companies address issues such as climate change, child labor in the supply chains, and only a third of respondents say that they target corruption and bribery. So there were some really shocking examples. 12% of respondents from China say their companies address child labor in their supply chains. And 14% of respondents in Italy address gender equality. So a lot of companies claim that the complexity of today's global supply chains makes monitoring and control really difficult. And 49% of the survey respondents cited, you know, this as the #1 barrier to acting responsibly. And this was only 3 years ago, right? And in a world where, you know, 69 out of the top of the world's 100 largest economic entities are corporations and not governments. So 70% are corporations. It puts a huge burden on the private sector to act and accept the responsibilities for the responsibility of their supply chains. And we need to take action, right? So this is only sort of 3 years ago. Now, look, I saw what, you know, Microsoft did in, you know, at Davos last year in terms of, you know, committing to reduce carbon to net zero by 2030 and also, you know, create a positive impact by 2050, and that was leadership in deciding to do that. It helps that they have a lot of cash as well. But for me, there's been really limited innovation in this space, in trade and in trade finance. I mean, there's been a few notable cases in this case, and I think you know, Marissa talked to one that Lloyd's are doing in terms of trying to find, you know, we can talk a little bit more detail around, you know, is incentivization and reducing the cost of financing really effective or not? But it's pretty limited. You know, there's, you know, I think you can count on one hand the number of companies that are using responsible supply chains or sustainable supply chains to incentivize vendors. I mean, there's not many of them out there. But the good news is that we are seeing a lot of improvement in this. So the demand for more sustainable practices and rating agencies, or say sustainability rating agencies, has increased dramatically over the last year. And a lot of it is being driven by ESG investors. So it's being driven by the market demanding that companies that they invest in report on and are responsible. And that is leading to significant, you know, to people to rethinking. And for me, it's always starting at the top of the organization. It's, you know, does the CEO and the management team believe in it? And do they put in place the culture to move it forward? Otherwise, it's just, you know, what is known as greenwashing in the market. And I think, unfortunately, what we've seen is only when it's legislated do we see action, which is why I'm very excited by the EU taxonomy. I mean, I'm a free market economist by background, but unfortunately, in my view, actually, you have to regulate to get action in this particular case. And you've seen that with, say, the Anti-Slavery Act. You've seen a lot of, you know, companies being forced to report on anti-slavery. That's led to action in this space. And I actually have sort of a contra view on the impact of the pandemic. I think it's actually put sustainability agenda backwards, in my view, because of, you know, other than for legislation purposes, because of investment. A lot of companies are struggling to survive right now. Cash is king. They have limited room for investment, and therefore, the first priority is survival. And the reason why you are seeing plastic being used, the most expedient ways to solve for the pandemic, which is a crisis. It is a environmental emergency, but it's not one that is allowing for increased investment. But I think one of the unintended consequences, which might be positive, is that this need for increased visibility of supply chains is absolutely there. Most companies have no idea what's happening in their supply chain, right? And this requirement for increased visibility will, and because of increased resilience, not because of environmental, because of increased resilience, is going to lead to more transparency in supply chains. And that is going to benefit investors who then want to invest in companies that have sustainable practices and they can be demonstrated. But I think, unfortunately, we start with what's required, and I think it's going to be an unintended consequence as a specific intended consequence for most companies. Sorry.
I think it was one of the interesting points that came out of Rebecca's conversation with Fred Hochberg earlier this week, that he made the point that supply chains have never been more in the public eye. People know what supply chains are. When there was the scrambling for PPE in sort of March, April, May time, it suddenly became a phrase that I guess those of us that know the trade finance industry have been familiar with, but it's become sort of more popular in parlance, I guess. So hopefully that will give some more scrutiny to avoid some of those practices. Do you think?
I think so. I think the fact that supply chains shut down and there was a supply crisis as well as a demand crisis, and the supply crisis was critical, and there was very, very specific areas that specific types of goods that were required in mass quantities that suddenly couldn't be produced and had to be produced, and led to people kind of reevaluating what's required. And so I think supply chains is going to be part of the language going forward, which is, I think it's good news for trade.
Yeah, fantastic. Shona, I saw you nodding along. Is there anything you want to come in on there?
Yeah, no, I was actually just going to add to what Michael was saying and Marissa earlier on, just to really think about this sort of, is sustainability just an add-on to good business? It's actually core to good business, because good businesses are, by definition, sustainable and resilient and can withstand shocks. The economics and the resources, so materials, the access to raw materials, access to goods, access to human resources, those all need to be nurtured and looked after in businesses. And if they're not, if they're not, then you can see this, as Michael sort of alluded to, this complete sort of meltdown in the supply chain, which ultimately, destroys businesses from the inside out. And I think it's a good business can withstand something which is completely unpredictable. COVID has highlighted that to us. It has shown us that anything can happen, and we can all be taken unawares. And actually, climate change is probably the most unpredictable thing of all, that none of us have actually really built into our business models. It's just not being addressed. It's still remaining, at the edge of business. It's seen sometimes as an innovation. It's like, why is tackling climate change an innovation? This should be front and center of the way we're all thinking. And ultimately, climate change is not something that can be fixed with a vaccine. So we need to think about it very seriously.
Quite. I want to come back to you on a couple of points, Shona, but firstly, just back to Michael, you mentioned around sort of the idea of incentivization and cheaper financing, but is there the view that in many ways cheaper financing is unsustainable itself, as it reduces the margins for those FIs getting involved?
Yeah, absolutely. I think cheap financing is not the way to go. I mean, fundamentally, let's talk about a typical supply chain finance program. It costs money to set up, it costs money to run. You have to onboard each of the vendors. If you add a sustainability layer to that, you're adding a level of reporting that's above, lending to a non-sustainable or providing supply chain financing to non-sustainable parties. And then also you're reducing the cost, which impacts the return on capital for the financial institution. in my view, that's, yeah, you can put $1 billion against it, or $500 million, or whatever it happens to be, but it's always going to be a small percentage of the overall book. And so therefore, in its very nature, it's not sustainable. I think, a far better way of looking at it, comes back to leadership from the top. For financial institutions, it's about deciding that the capital you're going to allocate to non-sustainable businesses is less. And you're going to allocate more capital to sustainable businesses that have a positive impact on the economy. I mean, what Microsoft has done in terms of basically putting a tax on internally and reallocating that tax to sustainability and creating a fund, that is a sustainable, that's a model that I think financial institutions can copy. And I've seen some banks like Natixis actually pick it up and add a capital tax onto non-sustainable businesses. That requires them to include definitions and all the rest of it, but it's a step in the right direction that actually creates a sustainable business. I mean, I used to joke that lending to an oil trader at 50 basis points for 30 days was a very, very low risk for me as a banker, because you're likely to get it back after 30 days. Lending to a solar plant in India is a lot less, is a lot more risky. And even if at 5%, I may not get it back, right? So what is actually more sustainable from a banking point of view? And so it requires leadership to make some adjustments. And I think we've seen, Marissa, you mentioned it, I think we've seen some of the regulators begin to act and include climate change as a risk indicator. But from my perspective, it's too little too late.
Yeah, and Jeff, can I add to what Michael's saying? Because this whole topic about incentivization and what is there in the toolkit, it's a big interest for me. And we discuss it all the time at the ICC Sustainable Trade Working Group. And I agree with Michael. It's just this pricing thing is just one of a number of things you can do, and there's a limit to what that can achieve. We need a lot more than just that. In terms of positive incentives, there's potentially fiscal or tax, there's league tables, there's awards, there's blended capital solutions, there's targeted programs from ECAs, there's a whole suite. And hey, let's talk about negative incentives as well, right? There's the whole topic around exclusions, punitive pricing potentially, and then that pressure from clients, from regulators, from investors. And just as an example, in the insurance unit at Lloyds Bank, so Scottish Widows, a few weeks ago, we committed that we will divest at least £440 million from companies that fail to meet our ESG standards, right? At our bank, we have 12 sector statements. We used to have only 6, but this year we added 6 more, 12 sector statements applying to direct lending. Sectors such as coal, mining, oil and gas, but some of the new ones that we've added are in agriculture, in animal welfare, in fisheries, right? We really need more action, and we really need things that are concrete and not just kind of talk. And I think, their pricing is one thing. It might be only kind of transitionary, but there are a lot of other ways, and we really do need kind of policy change. We need big changes for things to have a big enough impact.
Yeah, sounds like something of a balance to be struck in many ways. And you mentioned about leadership. I think this is a good segue to bring Jacqueline in, who comes from more of a political and diplomatic background. Onto the political side of things, Jacqueline, it does seem more likely that with President-elect Biden, and we are now still presuming that he's going to take office in January, we'll see the US make a return to something closer to its previous role as that leading world superpower and supporter of the multilateral order. One of the key initiatives being the US rejoining the Paris Accord. How important do you think that will be for this agenda?
I think it's important. Obviously, it's a major economic player, a major emitter. So clearly it's important. I don't think of itself it's transformative. I think other things that the US will do will be interesting as well. I'm sure that we'll see a return to playing an active role in the WTO. They will probably lift the moratorium on appointing members to the appellate bodies, which means that we can see a return to order in world trade. I think over time they'll probably lift all of the additional tariffs imposed, the punitive tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. But I don't think the US is going to fundamentally change its trade policy. I think, sustainability will be an element of it, but it won't dominate other national interests. If you look at things like US agriculture, for example, which is playing big in the prospect of a UK-US trade agreement, I don't see domestic rules, domestic practices on intensive agriculture, which is not very sustainable, changing. And therefore, in trade terms, they are going to have to argue for admission into other countries of the product of their unsustainable practices in trade and elsewhere in manufacturing. And I don't think that is likely to change overnight, particularly since the political situation in the States is going to be one where Biden is probably faced by a hostile Senate. He's going to have to look for bipartisan solutions, and that means that he's not going to be as radical as some of his voters would have liked him to be.
I suppose you mentioned about the sort of the area of free trade deals, and chlorinated chicken is always the example that we hear about. But I guess on a broader level, do you think sufficient attention is paid to sustainability when those trade deals are negotiated? Is it something that policymakers cover? And how can you expect businesses to follow the lead if governments aren't putting that at the forefront of their agenda, in your view?
I think that's a very fair point. Most free trade agreements do have a sustainable trade chapter, but it's very much a softer chapter, really soft compared to what you might call the substantive hard chapters on tariff reduction, removal of non-tariff barriers to trade, investment protection. All those things tend to be very detailed, very well embedded in trade agreements and justiciable, whereas the sustainable trade chapters tend to be lip service to some very basic principles and often not subject to litigation. So if one of the trade parties breaks the rules of that chapter, it has no impact whatsoever on the rest of the agreement. Unlike, for example, changing their tariff regime or changing their rules of origin or denying investment to an actor from the other party. So there's an inbuilt imbalance in most trade agreements. Is that likely to change? I'm a cynic, perhaps, or a pessimist. And I suspect not.
I think one of the other issues that came, I've got a question here actually coming in from the audience on this topic, which is with one of the sessions earlier, was talking about the idea of sustainability being in some view a luxury problem. And I heard it referred to in a conference I did a couple of months ago as a rich man's game. If we were in the emerging world, would sustainability be the same issue? And how can we bring businesses in emerging economies along? And I guess from your perspective as well, their governments and the directives that come from high, is there an imbalance here that makes this whole zero-sum game quite tricky to navigate in emerging markets?
I think it is difficult to some extent. I think there are challenges and there are opportunities. The challenge is that it looks like the West and the developed economies having benefited from a long period of unsustainable practices. And that's, to take Michael's point, that's not just environmental, it can be about labor standards or safety standards or production standards, has suddenly become holier than thou and is preaching to countries not yet industrialized about the need to maintain. So I think that's the challenge. The advantage for those countries is that they can take advantage of all our mistakes, all the things that the West has experienced, or the developed countries have experienced, and now perhaps looking back regret. They can avoid making those mistakes. It's like the digital leapfrog argument. you don't have to spend a lot of money putting in cables for a telephone network if you can move straight to a digital network. So I think there are possibilities there for the developing world. I think it's quite difficult for the developed world to manage that in their relations with those emerging economies.
Yeah, Jeff, I'd like to add a point on this one. I mean, I think
yeah.
when I think about this, you know, and I think about myself, you know, the amount of attention I pay to buying a white T-shirt for $3.99 versus buying a dress shirt for £100, I have a very different view in terms of checking whether the label says it's sustainable and, you know, ethically sourced and, you know, organic cotton and all the rest of it. But the $3.99 T-shirt, I'd probably just buy it on Amazon. I don't even look, because I just need a white T-shirt. And I think there's a difference in not only the cost of the good that you're buying, even in the developed world, but also, you know, I completely agree with Jacqueline in terms of, you know, the morals that are being applied by consumers in the West aren't necessarily the same as those being applied by a consumer in a less developed country, perhaps.
Does anyone else like to come in on this one?
I guess that.
Sorry, you go ahead.
I knew Shona wanted to say something, so I was waiting for her, and I was going to go after.
No, I was actually just going to say to the white T-shirt point, the power of the consumer is just enormous, and consumers will drive choices, and even consumers in developing countries will also make the moral choices. But it's really important that we give consumers information, and I think it's that lack of information, that lack of visibility, again, extending into things like the supply chain, so that we can actually see how products are produced and under what conditions they're being produced in. You know, when we look at things like innovation, you know, we're only really scratching at the surface of being able to make that data visible to everyone, to consumers, to the media, to regulators, to financiers. If we don't continue on that journey of actually just trying to, let's say, join up that data ecosystem, then we're going to really sort of miss the boat in terms of understanding that pulling and pushing power of the consumer. Because as Marissa said right at the top of this conversation, she's talking about this as a human. You know, we're all humans, we're all people. We do all think about our buying choices. So we need to know what it is that we're buying. So data is critically important.
Can I just come in on that point? Because I used to be in charge of consumer policy in the European Union before I came to London. And one of the big issues is information to consumers is important, but how do you convey it in a way that is meaningful, reliable, and timely? So back then, and still now, there was a lot of greenwashing, a lot of people arguing that their product was sustainable, their product was green, their product was environmentally friendly. We have some traditional tools, which are generally punitive tools, so people can't make false claims, but we don't have a lot of incentivization, and we don't have a lot of really useful independent third parties conveying that information. It would be really useful, for example, before people booked a flight, and if they had a choice between a direct flight or two different carriers, or to know how to be able to compare the emissions between the two alternative routes. Nobody is conveying that kind of information to the consumer currently. When you go online, which most of us will have been doing, to buy white goods, electronic goods, you don't automatically see, and you ought to see, anything about the energy rating. You can dig down and find it, but it doesn't leap out at you. And if, it's maybe not the equivalent of the $3.99 T-shirt, but it's something where you're cash rich, time poor, you're not going to dig underneath and find it. And I think we need to find ways of encouraging regulators, intermediaries, businesses themselves to put that information front and center at the time of purchase. Sorry,
And
I interrupted you, Marissa.
No problem. It was perfect because I just wanted to add to that. What's really exciting is finally the technology. And we know now the consumer demand is there to actually know what's going on behind the products. But finally, the technology it really is there or will be there very soon to be able to look through and see at the point where we need to see it. You know, when the consumer is there and purchasing this thing, they need to be able to see and measure. There are tech companies, there are fintechs. There are apps out there who you can measure a lot of these things. We launched a green buildings tool recently where you can put in the location of a building and know exactly the measurement of how green that is, and it also gives you tips and actions of what you could do to make it even better. And that's just one example. I think it's hit the retail sector a lot, right? And things are coming up in the headlines which maybe a few years ago would have been hidden. But I think consumers really want it, and that there's this emergence of a low carbon economy, right? There are these companies who are coming out, and they're the new businesses in the low carbon. And I think that's exciting to me, that there will be a part of the economy that's focused on supporting and building out new propositions to help in this space.
That's a fantastic segue, Marissa. Actually, I was going to bring in Shona as a tech disruptor in the form of Halo Trade. I guess, Shona, maybe you could share some details about your recent activities and what your pandemic experience has been, and also the stuff you were working on before that. And do you feel that minds have been focused maybe that little bit more around some of these issues as we're hoping?
Yeah. So thank you. So it's an interesting question, actually, because certainly I would say our pre-pandemic journey and our current pandemic experience are quite different, but have actually given us a really good opportunity, I think, to really sort of think about what we're doing. So ultimately, high level, Halo is really about trying to change, change the way of doing business. So it's about trying to change a business model through conditionally opening up access to markets and access to investment. And the way that we do that is by using technology to leverage finance and to give visibility and transparency into the supply chain. So what I was referencing earlier is making data available, whether it's to consumers, whether it's to businesses, whether it's to financiers, that then enables them to, on the one hand, it could be to release cost savings that can be ultimately channeled back into investments at origin and through the supply chain, whether it's about being able to give a helping hand through the supply chain and redistribute some of the benefit that accumulates always at the top end of the supply chain, and actually help to redistribute that through the supply chain, because we've made that supply chain visible and transparent and people can see what's going on. And because then we can look at, everything from how products are grown, how agricultural products are grown, how the white t-shirts are manufactured, how workers are treated, and use that information as a condition to then enable these incentives or shutting out those companies that aren't able to achieve the right conditions. So it's both a carrot and a stick, let's say, our system. But it is ultimately, it's about looking at what the business model is and how that can be improved through conditional access. The pandemic has been very interesting. I think it's certainly given everybody, I think, time to reflect, time to think about what they're doing. There's been an awful lot of firefighting. There's been an awful lot of focus on pure survival, business survival, and this whole question about whether focusing on sustainability, that's a luxury, we'll leave that till later, we'll leave that till sort of after the pandemic, that's certainly happening on one hand. But on the other hand, it's, I think, also giving a lot of companies time to really sort of think about that whole green recovery and, have we been doing everything right already? Is there a new future out there? And so certainly there are projects that we are, putting together at the moment that are really starting to address issues both around production, but I think also looking at that sort of human element that I think often gets lost in this argument, which is, how do we protect our human resources? How do we make sure that people aren't being exploited? I mean, I think the pandemic has has really highlighted how people have just been discarded, forgotten, left to starve on the streets, left to die on the streets. And I think that shared sort of sense of humanity, and we're all in this together, I think is starting to really bring out that whole sort of social and labour element to add to the overall mix. So, you know, when we look at the E, the S and the G, they're all equally as important as each other, because as I said sort of earlier on, you know, you cannot have a resilient, sustainable, healthy business without addressing all of those issues. So I think it's been a very fruitful time, I would say. I think as companies have just realized that watching supply chains go into sort of absolute meltdown and then reform in front of their eyes, I think is giving us all a really, you know, fantastic opportunity to rethink. And I think Halo and the work that we've done in the past in Malawi alongside Michael's good previous bank, you know, that work that we did with the smallholders, I think we really sort of demonstrated that you can bring together finance and technology and create transparency and opportunity for reinvestment. And so it was a model, certainly. You know, it hasn't yet been scaled or sort of adopted at, you know, at any across many supply chains, but we've got a couple of projects, sort of smaller projects, that we've been replicating that model on. To keep testing. One of the things obviously with innovation and startups is that you have to test and validate your results before you can then sort of build on that. But I think there's something there, let's put it that way, that could be pretty special.
Yeah, I think the idea of sort of, you said, that human element combining with technology seems like a lot of responsibility is being placed at the door of technology to navigate many issues, as we know. And as you say, that understanding of global differences, just reference that human element. There's a question we've got in here from the audience, actually, which is maybe talks more to the human element in the form of SMEs, you know, often family-run businesses and small enterprises. And these are often seen as the major ESG culprits, I suppose, to use a pejorative phrase. But you know, I guess, is there a cost element to adhering to these principles that SMEs can't afford, and how can people work together to solve the problems around?
Yeah, so I love that question, because yes, cost is always seen as being a barrier. You know, how can we afford the audits? How can we afford to make the changes that are required in order to meet the standards? And that those are very real issues for SMEs, and are often one of the reasons why, you know, they perhaps maybe opt out of you know, certain standards, or they opt out of even selling to certain companies, certain customers, because they just simply can't achieve the standards that are being required of them. Now that, you know, that can never be a good thing, because ultimately we want this to be inclusive. We want everyone to feel that they can up their game. So, and, you know, if this is a shared and common problem, and large corporations are equally as accountable, or in fact more accountable, for what goes on inside their supply chains, they ultimately have to be able to help everyone who is part of that ecosystem. So if that means sharing the burden of the cost, then so be it. They really should. Now, again, to go back to the work that we undertook with Halo Trade and the other partners that we worked with, what we were really trying to achieve was a way in which those, let's say that the sort of financial benefit that ultimately sort of always seems to accumulate at one end of the supply chain, the top end of the supply chain, could be shared back. So therefore the burden of the cost of investing in more sustainable production could actually then be supported throughout. So the you know, big corporations can support the SMEs in the middle of the supply chain, all the way down, in fact, to the smallholder farmers. So it isn't something that should be impossible, and it certainly shouldn't be a barrier, but it is about trying to change the way profit works and remove cost, remove unnecessary costs. And those unnecessary costs can be removed through things like automation, taking out laborious processes that duplicate you know, activities. Just remove some of that. No need for all of the independent handoffs that there are in systems. You know, bring it together, streamline it, share data, have data that you can trust because it's held in a secure way. That increases efficiency, it reduces risk, it reduces cost, and ultimately it leads to there being more profit that can be made available to reinvest in more sustainable businesses.
And just to add to Shona's point, he's talking about cost, and I think that's a key element, especially with talking to smaller businesses, right? Cost is really important. And the energy minister suggested that UK firms could save as much as £6 billion by lowering their energy use by 20% by 2030. So you know, sometimes the way to share and kind of speak to the benefit of sustainability, it's not a luxury. It can help you in terms of on the cost management side. And then the other thing Shona mentioned was risk as well. You know, it's not just a luxury, it's about risk management. So all companies, big and small, you're gonna have to think about the risk, transition risk, physical risk, and reputational risk. It's not only limited to the biggest companies anymore. So I think it's really something that companies of all sizes need to think about. And beyond just pricing incentives, there's this theme coming about you know, pricing incentives not just enough. It's not enough, especially if the margins are so thin anyway. But something which I've seen in Halo Trade, and I love your experiments and how you've pivoted and changed what you've done because of the evidence of previous, I guess, pilots and things, is beyond the pricing. It's also the education and just making it easier for companies and for entities to understand, you know, how it works, what's available, what tools are available, what can they do. So I think the education part is also really key.
Just next question, I'll probably get a view of all of you on this. Earlier we had a session around standards and measuring sustainability. Within your various roles, do you think we're any closer to reaching agreement on that issue? Maybe as you're, Marissa, starting with you and then hearing the rest of the group.
Michael I think he already talked about the EU taxonomy, so I think that's quite promising. And whilst we're leaving the EU, it's likely they will become the principles we adhere to. I think equally, there's also the LMA green loan principles, there's the ICMA green bond principles. I think there's clearly more we can do though. I think for trade finance, this is trickier. It's short-term nature, but it's necessary, and we're really not there yet, I think. And there's, yeah, in terms of standards though, that the challenge I see is there's so much varied methodologies. You've got all the different rating agencies, they've got different ways. You've got companies who have different ways they weigh the E, the S, and the G. So there's still a lot of different approaches. And I think everybody could benefit from more standardization. And hey, you know, there's the ICC, there are a lot of, you know, industry bodies out there who can help with standardization.
Maybe I can. I've got a few views around this, and I think the first thing is that there are a lot of standards, and there are a lot of voluntary standards that are out there. Whether it's, you know, RS, was it? The exact terminology, is it RSPO for palm oil? You know, there's UTZ for cocoa, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of voluntary standards that are out there, and I think if I remember, there was you know, these have been, you know, I think the IFC and ITC and a few others have put together some really good work around pulling that stuff together, and I think the ICC group are pulling that together to sort of what are the standards for trade, and I sort of think about this in sort of four key buckets. You know, one is really around sustainable goods and the standards associated with sustainable goods. So, you know, what's sustainable palm oil versus non-sustainable palm oil. There's sustainable companies who are meeting, you know, let's say minimum standards like gender equality, minimum wage, and so on and so forth. There's also then the sustainable end product. So, you know, for example, solar panels, maybe the production of solar panels is not particularly sustainable, but the end product leads to a sustainable outcome. And then you've got transition industries that where impact reduction is really important. And you have to start to think about, you know, it's almost like we're going to have an industry by industry kind of standard at some point that says, you know, what are the sustainability standards for, you know, for oil and gas? What are the sustainability standards for you know, manufacturing or paper production or whatever it happens to be? And what's the high bar? What's the mid bar? And what's the low bar? And I think we're going to end up with, you know, industry standards. that are going to include the legislation that comes through. And I think the question then is, how do you apply these standards, and how do you decide from a financing point of view where you allocate your capital, and what level gets at what price for the capital, and how does that change the price? I think that's still to come. But I think the conversation has moved. I mean, I've just having, the first ICC sustainability meeting we had, I think in Joburg in 2017, if I remember correctly, was, it was a very, very, small group of people kind of getting together, and, mainly from the multilateral development banks with a few bankers. I think the last one was over 50 people. It was a big group of people getting together to discuss. So I think the conversation has evolved, and Harriet and Roberta that are leading that are doing a really great job. And I think you'll get the development of those standards, and then the question is really going to be how you apply them in a different thing. That's going to be where the rubber hits the road, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think I was just going to say, I think, when we look at standards, if you don't measure, you can't act. So you need to have benchmarks, you need to have standards. I do have a worry that there are too many labels, far too many labels, and far too many boxes being ticked that just sort of appease people's consciences and help them try to, I suppose, show that they're doing the right thing without them actually necessarily fundamentally digging deep and looking at what the drivers are inside their business and the impact that they genuinely are having on everyone else. So ultimately things like poverty are huge drivers. Poverty and sort of inequality are just huge drivers for why some of the standards that we want to achieve just can't be achieved in their cultural context. And not, it's a very uncomfortable truth really for people to actually sort of think, well, how do we fundamentally address these things? And I think it's that there needs to be, rather than reaching for, have I or have I not achieved a standard? Have I or have I not earned that brownie badge to put on my sleeve? We actually sort of, really need to take a long, hard look at what, each company is doing in its own right with its own individual business. I mean, there is a supermarket who very much moved away from a UK supermarket that very much moved away from the whole idea of sort of the badges and the certifications, and actually said, well, no, we just don't think that's enough. We need to go far, far deeper than that. We need to actually look at the impact that we're having as a company and what we can do to help to support those that supply us, and ultimately give that information to our consumers. And I really take my hat off to them, because I really think that they've thought about that issue very deeply. And I think more needs to be done in a similar vein.
Just changing tack slightly. Sorry, Jacqueline, you were going to say.
I'll just make two quick points. The first is, on the whole, I think voluntary standards are to be encouraged. But I would put in a caveat that sometimes they are an alibi for governments not taking difficult decisions. In other words, they encourage voluntary schemes because they are reluctant to bite the bullet of putting in place legislation, regulation that would mandate change. And the second thing I think is that standards can be really useful as a supplement to legislation. One of the things that the European Union has done has put in place principles for products, but then allowed compliance to be through a series of different standards. So to allow industry to develop its own means of meeting those requirements. And that gives space for innovation as well, and forward movement. So I very much endorse Shona's point that if you have a plethora of standards, everybody's got their own little scheme, it becomes meaningless to the consumer. And that's why I think quite often you have to ally a standard with regulation.
Just moving on slightly, but sticking with you, Jacqueline, I've got a question. This question here also relates to a question that's coming from the audience, and also to the whole principle of this event. Much of the focus of this event is around national security, national strategy. Are we likely to see ESG moving away from being a green issue and more part of national security strategy? One of the interviews yesterday spoke about the securitization of sustainability. And that ties in as well to, the UK launching a green bank while simultaneously cutting its overseas aid budget. Does that suggest that governments are having a limited view of sustainability being green? I guess that's sort of, potentially one view. What's your thoughts on that?
I think one of the things that the pandemic has probably forced governments to consider is things like energy security, food security, pharmaceutical security. So I do think that might initially lead to a kind of retreat into a bit more economic nationalism. What can we do to make sure that in the next pandemic, we're not so highly reliant upon overseas producers, very long supply chains? I think the move to cut foreign aid is short-sighted, but one can understand where it's coming from in terms of the electoral response and the economic realities. So green, I think, will remain a big poster principle for sustainability. But I do think the more thoughtful politicians will dig underneath it and look at things like autonomy, long-term security of certain key supplies.
Fantastic. I think to wrap up, we're nearly out of time, and thank you to everyone that sent their questions. But maybe Sir Bold, I'd like to ask you all, perhaps in 30 seconds, no more than a minute if possible, ask you all what action needs to be taken to avoid us all having this exact same conversation in 5 years' time, time that many will argue the planet doesn't actually have. And perhaps you could each name one positive and decisive piece of action that needs to be taken to avoid the risks that we've spoken about and affect real change. Starting with you, Michael, I suppose.
Yeah, I think Jacqueline summed it up in the previous comments, which is really around standards and regulation. Without standards and regulation, we're not going to get wholesale change. We're only going to get intermittent change.
Over to Shona. Shona, I think you're mute.
Sorry, sorry about that. I was just going to say, if nothing changes, then we will be lucky if we're still having this same conversation in 5 years' time. Things are going to get an awful lot worse. And, the impacts of climate change could be as exponential in their devastating impact, or if not even worse, than the pandemic has been. So we need to act now. Before it's, it's the old thing, before it's too late. The most important thing for us to do is that we need to do everything we possibly can to aim for carbon neutrality. We have to invest in renewable sources of energy, and we need to scale carbon sinks. We need to throw everything and the kitchen sink at this. Full stop. We don't have time to waste.
Jacqueline?
What I would like to see is some really clever tech person make use of near-field technology so that as you went around your supermarket, it told you, as you picked up things from the shelves, exactly what your carbon expenditure was. So that you weren't just looking at, the pounds at checkout, but you were also looking at things like air miles, emissions, and so on. And that might force people to make better choices at the point of purchase. I don't know whether it can be done, though.
It exists.
It does.
It's not us. It's not us. But I know a company that does just that.
Definitely. Yes.
Oh, okay.
And,
great.
Fantastic. We should investigate that further. And finishing with you, Marissa.
Okay, I'm going to say a really strange thing to say on a panel, but I think we should have less chat and more action. And one thing I love is that, this is the problem that we all need to solve. We're all in it together. So we need collaboration and we need healthy competition. So I celebrate each time something's done, something's actually done. And I don't care if it's my bank, I don't care if it's a different bank. When Natixis came up with their green weighting factor, here I am saying, hooray, right? That's great, because there's healthy competition. Because us and other banks will say, okay, how do we go about doing that as well? At the beginning of the year, we committed to have emissions that we finance by 2030. So that was a first. And then all the other, our competitors came after and said, okay, how do we do that as well? So I really like this. We need to take more action. If you're in trade and trade finance, don't just think about the paper, please. That's definitely not enough. We need systemic change. So incremental change is not enough. It can't be side of desk. It can't be an afterthought. And it's, as Shona says, this is big. And in 5 years' time, if we don't change the way we're working, it's not going to look pretty.
Great message to finish on. Thank you to our speakers for sharing their insights, and indeed to you, our viewers, for tuning into this discussion and posing your questions, which I hope we were able to address. That brings this week's Future of Strategy event to a close. We've enjoyed a fantastic week. Had around 400 registrations, many people participating throughout the course of various sessions, covering supply chains, SME challenges, the role of national security and trade in that, and today's focus on sustainability. As I'm sure you already know, all the content from this week has been made available on demand via the Coriolis website. So you can catch up with anything you might have missed, and there's some great discussions to be enjoyed, including this one, of course. But in the meantime, on behalf of Rebecca and the Coriolis team, many thanks for participating. Take care, and we'll see you next time.